Hi there. Let's take a few minutes and talk about how we can blend our documentation and our UI text into incredible customer information experiences. It's going to be great. My name is Matt Reiner. I'm a customer advocate. That means I work with users who use our apps for tech writing, and I figure out how we can make them better, and I share that with my team. And that's really fun because I used to be one of those users. This is a little bit about us, and it's important because we're going to talk about how my team at K15T built content experiences in one of our most recent apps. So first of all, we make like 14 apps for technical writing and content management in Confluence. That's how I met the team. And these apps are actually made specifically for teams. So we have teams in mind when we build them. And the idea is we really want teams to be able to get going very, very quickly using our apps. So don't have to bring in consultants. You can just point and click your way into using them. And while that's the ideal, especially as we've introduced really powerful features, it's gotten a bit rough for some of our users. So we get a lot of questions on, okay, but what do I do now? Or just straight up roadblocks where users say, okay, like I don't know what to do next. I don't know how to learn that. So we're stuck. And that just ends up leading to messes. And generally, users get discouraged by this, and some of them even choose not to use our apps. That's been really disappointing. But you may be thinking, as I did for a long time, it's okay. We've got a help center. It's glorious. They can go to this help center. It's been optimized for finding content and doing exactly what they need to do to learn to be successful. But then I learned the hard truth, and that is users don't really care about our help center as much as documentarians do. I think it's accessible and searchable and beautiful, but to users, it's that other thing over there that I really don't want to visit if I don't have to, because I'm trying to get something done in this app that I'm looking at right now. And here's the hard truth about that app. Users don't really care about your app all that much either. Your product that your team puts together is secondary to what it is they're actually passionate about. They care deeply about something, they're trying to accomplish something, and your app is just a means to that end. So my team looked at, okay, how can we center our experience around what it is they're looking to do and not about our app or our documentation specifically. So we went to the place that all teams go when they're searching for something new. And I found this video by Dan Stevens, and this talk is really incredible. He talks about working at Atlassian at the time and helping create experiences using content from marketing teams, UI, design, and documentation, and building these incredible, what they call information experiences. It's a need to watch talk, totally changed my career. I'm kind of building off it. So he said this in one of his articles: humans will more readily accept and adopt things which they can place in the context of a story. The more coherent the narrative, the more pleasing the experience. I thought this was perfect. This is exactly what we need to do. We need to take our content and guide users through learning how to use our apps. So let's talk about the recipe that my team brought together on how we combine different pieces to kind of implement what it is Dan talks about here. So first of all, we're going to talk about why it really matters to build information experiences. Then we'll talk about the pieces you need to sort of have in place to get started. Then we'll talk a little bit about working with a designer to understand user journeys. Then we'll talk about aligning our documentation with those user journeys, those user flows, structuring content for reuse, and then how to connect your documentation to your app to create that experience between the two. Then we'll look at the need to focus on voice and tone, saying just enough in our writing, and avoiding assumptions. These are more and more important as we create these experiences. Then we'll talk about aligning with marketing to create an even extended information experience for users from the point they meet our company on. So let's pull up this recipe. Yeah, okay. So there's a lot of different ways you can do this. This is just one option. This is the recipe that worked for the team at K15T. You might need to have a variation of this or do something totally different. So I encourage you to get out there and see what other options are there, or put your own spin on this and share with us what's been successful for you. Okay. Go away. So the first thing we need to put together is, just like every recipe you find online, before we can actually get to the fun stuff, we've got our hands ready to work, we actually have to read through a really, really long story about why it matters that we do this. So let's do that. There's three groups of people who really benefit from why we build information experiences. The first one is our users. And that's because this work is based around the concept of progressive disclosure. Jacob Nielsen, a UX expert, says it's a technique where you defer advanced or rarely used features to a secondary screen, making applications easier to learn and less error prone. Essentially, what progressive disclosure is all about is, imagine you have a wizard. And the first wizard, you only have just a couple of options in your app and just a little bit of information. You can learn quickly and do something quickly. Then you move to the next step, which has slightly more complicated options and a bit more text to learn about those, and so on and so forth. So users can essentially learn and go at the same time, and they constantly get that feeling of, oh, I'm doing it, I'm learning, I'm doing it. That's really exciting, and it helps us as text writers to be able to document those experiences that might be difficult to explain, like very complicated UIs. And also, while we're writing our documentation, it helps us know where users might be coming from if they get into our long-form content. Oh, okay, you might need help with this particular UI. We also build information experiences because it benefits our own team. It helps us to appreciate everyone's work more. We can appreciate UX designers and content developers like tech writers or other documentarians more because we're bringing their work together. It also allows us as a team to do a lot more cross-training, right? I might be a really good writer, but I need help from a UX designer or an engineer to put my writing in context of what it is users are doing or what it is our app actually does. And then also we benefit from combining content creation with the rest of our software development processes, because once content is an important part, we actually can't ship the product until we have all the documentation and all the UI text in place. And yes, we benefit, good job security for documentarians, but much more importantly, our users benefit as well, because then they have that great content in their hands. And then finally, the last why is we do this for the sake of the company, for our organization. By creating great information experiences, we increase customer love. By automating tasks that they have to do all the time, we fill in gaps of knowledge, we help build love for the product, and we eliminate frustration. We also can boost the product value in people's minds, because not only can they do things faster or in a more understandable way, they may even discover more features they didn't know existed. And then finally, we can lessen the burden on the support team. Yay! That sounds like money saved. So we've talked a little bit about, the story, why we do this, so long. Okay, let's actually talk about putting this all together. So first off, there are some things that we need to have in place, some ingredients, so to speak, to get going with this. First off, do not be intimidated by the size of your documentation or the size of your app. It could be massive, and you could be sitting here listening to me thinking, I could never do this. I don't have enough time in the day. Constrict your focus. That's the way we got started. This is just one part of one of our apps. We have a bunch of apps. Think about, what can you focus on first to be successful? So some examples are, maybe just build a few experiences around your newest feature, ones that the team is working on right now. Or maybe the features that you already know have some of the best documentation that's been written, and that should make it easier to create great content, both in the documentation and in the UI. Or maybe the team is currently redesigning a part of your app. Maybe that's where you want to focus your time, building some experiences there. We did a little bit of each because we were both redesigning parts of our app and also adding some new features. So that's why this worked well for us. Also, do not start making changes without talking with people first. You will make more enemies than you make changes. Instead, learn who on the team does what and who has done what. Don't disrespect past work. Don't comment on bad UI text or bad documentation. Chances are you're either disrespecting yourself or someone else on the team who did those things at one point. They're probably not proud of it. You don't need to remind them. Share what it is you'd like to do, what information experiences are about and why they matter. In my case, the team was already focused on revising a bunch of our screens and things, so it was a very easy transition into, hey, let's make the rest of our content shine just like these UI changes, which was cool. Finally, we need to do a big audit. And I know that sounds fun, but it's an important part of the process. Once you've focused down on this one area that you want to build an information experience around, you really have to dig in and make lists of things, take screenshots, ask questions. It's sort of a messy process, and it ends up, just looking kind of like a giant table. At least that's what it did for us. But you're going to ask questions like, what are all the error states that I could create here? And is the text good here? Or how many variants of this process are there? If I click this and this, or if I click this and this, what text am I going to see? Is it going to make sense with the UI? What documentation do we have on it? And so forth. And you're going to work with the whole team on this. People are going to know all the little things that the app can do. As an example, we had a ton of back and forth about talking about design changes, UI changes, and documentation, like what links currently exist. So we used a huge Confluence page full of tables where we kind of noted this all down. It's a mess, but we understand it, right? So these are the ingredients that we need to bring together. Let's then look at sort of the next step here, which is, where do we start? We've got things ready to go. What do we do next? So what we're going to do here is we're going to talk to our friendly neighborhood user interface designer, because we really need to understand the flows that users walk through in order to use our application. See, designers control sort of the journey that users are on way before they typically get to documentation. And now that we want to build an information experience, we need to get with them to figure out why it is users do what they do and how it is they do that. So they will provide you a user flow diagram, something like this. It could be very simple, or it could be a bit more complicated. And what you want to do is you want to sort of clear your mind of what you know of the product, and then walk through each of these paths, even just mentally, and write down every time a question arises. You get to a certain point and you say, well, what does this field do? Or you read about a concept and you say, well, what is that thing? Write all those questions down and write down where you encounter those in the UI. These are going to be really important. And by the way, if you don't have a UI designer to make a flow diagram like this, that's okay. You can make one yourself. Then the next thing we're going to do is sort of put together a map. And I call it a map. It's not really a visual thing. But the idea here is document, for every app or for every screen or maybe for every field, what text exists, what links to documentation, what in-app help is there to provide more context. And then figure out, where does more UI text need to be added? Where do we need to have links to expanded descriptions in the app? Or where do we need to link out to documentation altogether? This is the list that my team put together. So we documented each link, where it was, what it links to now, and that will really help us distinguish in the future sort of what we need to improve. The last thing we need to kind of think about with our designer is what actually needs to be said, because the designer has a vision for what should be communicated through the UI. And what they think needs to stay the same. And they may also point out like, hey, I think this text really needs to be changed. So figure out where the UI actually needs to be changed versus using text. The designer probably knows these places too, but you don't want to document around a bad UI. You need to improve that. So don't even spend time trying to fix that with content. Really identify those areas, and then focus particularly on the interactive parts of your app. So wizards with steps that users move through, or complicated menu structures, anything that might be unintuitive. Those are the places where typically a good focus on content is needed. In our case, the UI text was in pretty good shape, as was the design, but we were making a lot of changes to our main user flows, and then also the way we were talking about parts of the product. So we've got a good start here. The next thing that we really need to look at is excuse me, how we can restructure our content to work across an information experience, that is, between your app and your documentation. So let's take a look at that. So the first thing that we're going to do in this part of the process is to look at how we align those user flows that I mentioned with the documentation we have, right? So we understand the flows that users walk through, the designer's intentions, and then we have that content map that we created. So now we need to move through the structure of our documentation and revise the content there. So we want to group and order our content based more on the user's interests and the flow. Right? We need to rename pages to align with the questions that we documented that come up, like what is this? We need a topic, right, that is named around that, so there's an answer in our documentation. And then we need to be able to make sure that users at any point in our documentation can jump in, right? Even if you link to a heading on a page or a subheading, users should be able to pick right up there and continue going. So you might need to add a little bit more description there or something. Here's an example of what we did. We ended up having to sort of rework the order of our pages quite a bit, and then also those titles to align more with the new jobs that our users are doing based on the redesign that my team was working on. Your work might be a bit different, but this is sort of what we found. Then we want to focus on creating reusable pieces of content. So that is, each piece of content needs to be able to stand on its own, big or small. Users need to be able to read them, and it needs to make sense. So some of the pieces that we created are short descriptions for every page. So that's just a paragraph or a sentence that describes that page of documentation. That's really useful. And then breaking out an introductory portion, especially on a concept topic, and I'll show you how we use those, but it's sort of generally, here's the main description of what the thing is, sort of the overview. That has to be able to stand on its own. And then finally, the entire concept topic needs to be written in a way that it can incorporate that short description, then that overview, and then the rest of the long form content. So remember how we broke it up, right? We have UI text, we have in-app help, and we have documentation. I've mentioned all of those, but I wanted to kind of describe for you why we did that. I kind of stole this design principle from Apple. They used to have on iPhones this thing called peek and pop, which was if you touch something, you got a little bit of information. If you held it a little stronger, you got a little more information. A little stronger, you got more information. A little stronger, and they'd give you info for a place you can go have your screen replaced. But this is a really good example of progressive disclosure. Ironically, they removed it from iPhones because they didn't figure out how to explain it to people. But this is actually exactly what we used in our app. We used this kind of peek and pop design to progressively give users more information as they needed it. So what we did was we first created a bunch of chunks of content. We do all our tech writing in Confluence, so we just created Confluence pages. So here's an example of one. It has that introductory content that I mentioned for a page. So this content is written in a way that it can stand on its own. It makes sense that way. Then on each long form page in our documentation, I have an excerpt macro at the top that has my short description. I then have my introductory content that I'm including using a content reuse tool called an include page macro. And then below that, I have my long form content, just sort of the rest of the topic. So this page is brought together really well in our help center. Here's our help center. We use our app scroll viewport to take the Confluence content presented as a help center. That's all cool. Content looks seamless. That's great. But then also when our users are using our app, here's just one of our screens, they can click help and it opens up this dialog. And this dialog is pulling in that overview piece of content that we built earlier. And because it stands on its own, it makes a lot of sense to users. So they can look at the interface. If that doesn't make sense, they can expand, right? They can peek and look at a brief description. And if that's not enough, they can then click this documentation link here to pop over to our documentation to read the full article. So progressively, we are disclosing more and more information to them in the hopes that they'll be successful. So we've architected our content, we've got it ready to be put together, and we've connected our app and our documentation using our tool set. And remember, I showed you the tool set we use, but I'm sure the tool set you have also provides these kinds of abilities. So now what we're going to talk about is, okay, let's be real here. This is really cool work, but as an aside, you are going to get distracted from this because people are going to deem some work more important than creating information experiences, or people are just not really going to believe in the work you're doing with content. I'm sorry to say it, but it's true. But I would say, stay calm. Remember why we're building content experiences, information experiences matter, and be confident in your knowledge that this will benefit everyone. So, aside over, let's go. Now, let's talk about how we need to write in order to make sure content flows really well between documentation and UI and back. So, first up, we really need to focus on voice and tone now. Both voice and tone are always important when you're writing content, but now it's really, really important, and I'll explain why. If you're not familiar with voice and tone, or you're forgetting like I did before I was preparing this talk, here's a refresher. Voice is all about being consistent, having a standard way that you always communicate things when you're writing. So, for example, you may describe your company's voice as we always use simple wording to describe things. We are always helpful in our voice. We're always clever, but we don't joke. Those are the sorts of things that can always be the same no matter what you're talking about. Tone is a little different. Tone changes. Just like the way I talk is always the same, but the tone I use changes to be empathetic. So imagine, for example, you document importing data. You could make that very clever and fun, but what if users are coming to that documentation after experiencing an error in your application where they lose data and now they have to re-import it? You need to have an empathetic and consistent tone so that when you're bridging that gap and bringing users seamlessly over to your documentation, it doesn't sort of feel like an emotional slap to the face. So ensure that you're using that same level of empathy by having a consistent or at least intelligent voice and tone used throughout. Make sure you're saying just enough. If you're, if you love writing, especially if you're getting into the UI, you don't want to add too much text. In fact, you can work with your designer to make sure that you're not doing that. Sometimes you'll even identify text that needs to be removed. That's currently there. You're saying too much. It's confusing the users, or it's giving them more information than they need. Sometimes what's there is good, but it needs to be simplified. Sometimes content needs to be added, both to the documentation and to the UI. Especially with UI text, less is typically better. Finally, never assume anything, because it might put a roadblock in your user's path. For example, if your team makes an accounting app, don't make the assumption that your user understands all accounting terminology and lingo. Maybe it's geared toward accountants, but what if the executive assistant is entering values because the accountant is on vacation? Don't depend on their knowledge to be able to use your app. Instead, if you feel like users are going to need to know something, don't assume they do. Instead, the rule we follow is link to something. Link to your documentation, link to a glossary, link to someone else's documentation. Just help users when you feel like maybe there's a question in their mind because there's a question in mind. Don't create artificial roadblocks by leaving holes in your content. So we've talked about some really important things when it comes to making our content, writing our content. Now, the final part of the journey. That's right. This is the part of the journey where we connect with the marketing team. Yes, I said the marketing team. We want to extend this information experience beyond the point, like before they even start using our apps. And here's why we would do this. So a true user journey doesn't begin with our app. It begins long before that, when marketers reach our users. See, I used to think marketing was something different than it is. And the role they actually play is to make the market aware what our app does. And more importantly, how it helps a user do the thing that they're actually passionate about. Isn't that what we're building an information experience about? Marketing knows a lot about why our users would buy our app. and they understand sort of those things that help them enter into using it, which aligns really, really well with user flows. In fact, we should work together with marketing and share those user flows back and forth, because they can generally provide us even more information about the beginning part of that journey. And then we can also help marketing understand what it is users are doing with our apps to improve marketing content, to help them generate new ideas. You never know what the two teams will learn together. In fact, if you look at some of Dan Stevens' articles, he talks a lot about the work they did at Atlassian and how the documentation and the marketing team saw huge success working together on a project. Finally, collaborate with the marketing team. Write your content together. Use a tool like Google Docs or something where there's a shared editor, and try to benefit from each other's ideas and thoughts. Marketing is really good at talking about value propositions. Incorporate those benefits that they're very good at writing, because those are the benefits that users are looking for when they jump into and start using the feature that you're writing UI text for. Try to match voice and tone, maybe even share screenshots or diagrams for your documentation or for their marketing materials. Those are the ways that we can take this experience and make it consistent for our users, who in the end don't care who wrote the content. They don't care what department you were from or what you know about the product or what degree you have. They care, does the things that they read, do they all make sense? So let's think about things from that perspective. So we have created some amazing content with the marketing team. We've built a user experience here. So let's remember kind of what we talked about here. So first we talked about why it matters, and this is really important. We need to know this if we're going to sell the idea of information experiences to our leadership. We talked about where should we start, the pieces that we need to have ready to go. We talked about working with our designers to understand user flows and journeys so we could map content to those. Then we covered looking at our documentation against those user flows, how to structure our content for reuse across the two, and then how you can, sort of technically connect the two pieces. We talked a little bit more about voice and tone and why saying just enough really matters, but not to just make assumptions and how those can roadblock users. And then finally, we talked about extending that user experience to address our user from the beginning to the end of their journey with us by aligning with the marketing team. If you have questions, there's going to be an interactive Q&A time right after this in another space, so head over there. I'm really interested to know what you think, what questions you have, what you think could be improved about this, because remember, we're a community here, and this is just one recipe on how your team could do this. So please join me there in a little bit. Thank you so much for attending this talk. I really hope that you go out there and create a really, really cool experience for your customers so they can love your product and your content together. Good luck.
Thank you for a really great and well-produced talk. That is probably the first thing we're going to talk about, because we got a lot of questions and comments about what types of tools that you use to create your presentation and the transitions, also the diagrams and the maps that you use. So maybe do you want to give people an overview of your favorite tools and resources?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So I use the same tool primarily that Apple uses to announce their courageous and magical new features, Keynote. I actually used to use like Google Docs, slides, for most of my presentations, and then we started using it at my company. I think they use it a lot at Atlassian, and so one of my teammates caught on to that. But there's some amazing transitions because they're the same people. They also make video production software, so a lot of their transitions are really powerful. The most important one is called Magic Move, which essentially, if you have two slides following each other, if you have three objects on that slide, if you go to the second slide and you manipulate them, change them, move them, and then you magic move transition between them, it will like add these incredible fluid transitions between point A and point B. So it's kind of like really simple key animations. The rest of the diagrams and things were all created in tools within Confluence. My company, obviously we do a lot of stuff in Confluence. So I think the diagram, the big one, was done in Draw.io maybe. And then I can't take any credit for the icons. We do have some fantastic designers who made all of those. So yeah.
That's nice. I think Magic Move is the best kept secret in Keynote. I remember the first time I used it was actually for my Write the Docs presentation in 2018. And I was so nervous that I was like, what if it doesn't move and then it only stays? And it looked so good. I can recommend it as well. I think it's great.
Yes. I don't know if it's related to Write the Docs, but if people like need a presentation on how to use Keynote to make cool presentations, I'd be happy to give it. So I don't know. Tell that to your local Write the Docs representative.
Yes, sounds good. Take him up on that. All right, back into the content of your talk that you just gave. So we had a couple questions about, how feasible it is to implement these types of strategies, or how do you work on an existing product? So think like products that maybe are medium-sized, they might have time constraints or tech debt, and how do you mix that in, I guess, is the best way I could put it.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest challenge. And I realized I kind of cheated in this project. So in my last job, like rest assured, I worked on a medium to large enterprise product and, battled all the, tech debt demons and all of that. So I'm familiar with that. But in this project, I was lucky enough that while this is an existing product that I worked on primarily, it's relatively new. So our content base was small. I mean, I think we probably have like 30 to 40 final pages on our help center. So it's not massive. But yeah, the existing thing is important. And the most important thing is that you have a decent work-life balance, especially in these times. You need to make sure that you and your team are sound in mind and body, and that your family are getting the amount of time that you need to give them. So the things that come to mind for me are, look at where the team is investing in your product right now, like building a new feature, fixing things, or like maybe where your support team is just pouring buckets of unnecessary time. Those are the places where you can often get justification with leadership. And I have a talk from Write the Docs last year in Portland, all about getting justification for things. But that's a really great way to say, look, we're wasting time on this, or we're investing time on this. We should improve the content experience here, so that long term this feature becomes more valuable to the organization, to our users, etc. But yes, watch your time. It's important.
That's great. And I love that you mentioned, work-life balance and making sure you're maintaining a healthy work schedule. That was part of the question I didn't explicitly read out loud, but I think it's great that you mentioned it, because I think that kind of proves that it is possible to have both in this case. So
yes,
yeah, good mention. And then you talked a lot about, cross collaboration between different teams and working internally with teams that might be, different positions. So does this kind of work need a large amount of trust within a team, or can you maybe cultivate that? What do you think?
Yeah, I'm a promoter of this because I've been in so many different roles and been, even voluntold into several different roles. So I've done, I was a scrum master for a marketing team. I was a tech writer for a software development team. I was a project manager company. Team trust is what everything is built on. Yeah, I can't emphasize how important those dynamics are. I think in order to be successful in anything we do, we definitely need that trust. But when it comes to opening up our work and collaborating, especially with an organization like marketing, who, like, let's be real, they have the money, they have the people, they have the design resources, really. I mean, that's why my slides look great, because luckily our marketing people like good design. I mean, all of us do, but they are very important. So to be able to reach out and work with them is a privilege. That's the way I see it. And what I try to do is vocalize that. But it's all about having relationships. And again, in my last talk, I talked about having a relationship with marketing, sales, and support. again, the 3 teams that have the most money, most budget in the company, it's about how can we help them and how can they help us. So typically you can't just go out and be like, hey, I'm doing this thing. I want your help. By the way, my name's Matt Reiner. Nice to meet you. It takes time to build that level of trust that's needed to look at a bigger picture. And Dan sums it up really well in his talk, sort of the length of the journey that they took at Atlassian to build their first information experience. It's really inspiring.
Cool. And then, this seems like it's a common thread for you, talking about this collaboration between the different teams and all of that. Did you have a moment in your career where you really realized like, whoa, this kind of collaboration is essential?
Yes. So actually watching Dan's talk was really powerful for me to realize, oh, content matters. Like to the point where like, if we don't write stuff about stuff, that stuff might as well not exist. But then the moment that was really, really difficult for me was at my last job, we were maybe a 50-person company. My CEO sort of went rogue and he decided to make a whole new corporate website for us. He designed it in just like a, the kind of thing you would build your recipe website on. Didn't involve any designers or anything, wrote all the content himself. It was very much not professional. And, after reading through it, I actually had to confront him during a meeting with like the founder and the CEO and just say, we cannot go live with this. This is not going to work. And then they charged me with rewriting everything and redesigning the website. Great. So that was a heart-pounding moment, but the power of content really struck me like, we're not going to be able to sell our app, let alone get people the documentation where we need to explain it later on. So we better work together on this.
Man, good for you for being able to really like stand up to that. I think the whole time you were describing that story, my eyes were like getting bigger and bigger because it just sounds so frustrating.
Not recommended. Not fun.
I can imagine. And then our last question that we have is, y'all are bringing back these acronyms. I mean, are you using DITA? Is it DITA? DITA?
I've heard DITA. I've heard DITA. I've heard DITA. Yeah. We're not, but my background is originally I started tech writing in DITA when I was sort of forced into the role because we lost our properly educated tech writer. So I did a lot of work in DITA and I really came to respect the concepts of like topic-based authoring and content reuse and building in structures. So then my team was looking for something more collaborative. So that's why we moved to Confluence. And, I found that Confluence with some apps, the apps that my current company makes, I ended up joining the team because I liked the apps and the company so much. But you can build the same sorts of structures. And I found that you can do that with a lot of different apps, like anything that's built around DITA or DocBook, I know Confluence, they all support the same kind of structuring. DITA like controls you a lot and forces you to do it very often. But with things like Confluence, you just have to have the self-control and a process by which to do it. If you want some resources on that, if you just Google Rock the Docs and then K15T, not affiliated with Write the Docs. I don't know why we named it so similarly in retrospect, but there is a section there on how to do content reuse in Confluence. But those same concepts would work for many other systems, I think.
Oh, okay. I think if I have one takeaway from today, it's that I need to look up DITA more, be able to like interact with these chats. All right. So if anyone has any like lingering questions or needs some Keynote tips, where can they find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Reiner Matthew. You can find me lurking around on the Write the Docs Slack. If you're not there, you should be. Again, I think it's Reiner Matthew or Matthew Reiner. Especially join me in the Confluence channel where I like to ask questions and try to give answers.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Matt, for being with us today. I appreciate it.
Have a good evening, everybody.